This is a work of fiction. All characters, events, and military operations depicted are entirely fictional. The creek spoke first every morning. Before the light found the tops of the live oaks, before the humidity pressed itself against the windows like something alive, there was the water. Low, constant, patient in a way Declan Voss had never learned to be. He stood at the counter with his coffee, black, same mug he'd had since Charleston, the ceramic worn smooth where his thumb always rested. His left shoulder carried its usual complaint, a deep, grinding ache that had settled into the joint the year he turned 38, and never bothered to introduce itself properly. Rotator cuff. The doctors had given it a name. The name didn't help. Neither did the exercises they printed on a sheet he'd folded into his wallet and never unfolded again. The silence was the worst part. Not the shoulder. Not the knee that popped when he took the porch steps too fast. Not even the scar tissue that ran from his left elbow to his wrist like a road someone had tried to erase. The silence. Because in the silence, the ringing came. High, thin, constant. A frequency that lived inside his skull where no one else could hear it. Tinnitus. Another name that didn't help. He'd learned to live beside it, the way you learn to live beside a neighbor who plays music at odd hours. Not by fixing the problem, but by finding louder sounds to cover it. The creek helped. The marsh wind helped. Tools against a hull helped most of all. Titan pushed through the screen door and stood at the edge of the porch, head lifted, nose working the air. 85 pounds of German shepherd, coat the color of dark honey and charcoal, a notch in his left ear from something neither of them talked about. 7 years old, getting slower on the stairs, though he'd never admit it. The dog had arrived in Declan's life the way most important things did, not by invitation, but by default. Kyle Medina's name on a form. Kyle Medina's dog, now that Kyle Medina was a flag and a headstone, and a 24-year-old smile in a photograph that Declan kept in a drawer he didn't open. "Morning, buddy." The dog glanced back once, then descended the steps with that careful, deliberate gait. Not stiff exactly, just measured. Same walk every morning. Down the steps, across the packed dirt, past the overturned hull of the John boat Declan had been patching for old man Hebert, straight to the creek where the water pooled shallow between two roots of a cypress tree. Declan watched from the porch, one hand around the mug, the other resting on the rail. The wood was soft in places, salt air and moisture working their way through the grain, the way they worked through everything in the Low Country. Slow, patient, inevitable. He'd fix it eventually. He fixed everything eventually. Boats, generators, the dock that leaned a little more each season. Fixing things was what his hands knew how to do, when the rest of him didn't know how to do anything at all. Titan reached the water's edge, lowered his head the way he always did. Slow, purposeful, the big body folding down toward the surface. Then he stopped. The dog pulled his head back. Not fast, not the sharp recoil of pain or surprise. Slower, like something had spoken to him through the water in a language Declan couldn't hear. Titan shifted his weight, stepped back once, twice, and sat. Just sat. head turned toward Declan, eyes steady, ears forward, body absolutely still. Declan set the mug down. He walked to the creek and crouched beside the dog. The water looked the way it always looked, clear enough to see the sandy bottom, the small stones, the thin green threads of algae that clung to the cypress roots. The smell was marsh and mud, and the faint mineral tang of groundwater feeding into the flow. Nothing different, nothing wrong. He dipped 2 fingers in. Cool. Normal. He brought them to his nose. Nothing obvious. He looked downstream where the creek widened before it fed into the marsh, then upstream, where the tree canopy thickened and the water narrowed to a ribbon between banks of dark mud. "What is it, boy?" Titan pressed his shoulder against Declan's knee, not leaning for comfort, communicating. The way he used to press against his handler's leg when they were walking a perimeter and the dog sensed something the man's ears couldn't catch. In 18 years of Navy EOD, Declan had learned exactly one thing that mattered more than any technical manual or training pipeline or 3-day seminar at Eglin. Trust the warning you can't explain. The device that looks clean, the road that looks clear, the room that feels wrong before you can say why. The water looked fine, but Titan had never been wrong. Declan drove the 14 miles to Marlowe's Hardware before 8. The store smelled the way it had for 30 years. Sawdust, fertilizer, the sharp bite of metal and oil. He found what he needed on a back shelf behind the pool chemicals. A basic water testing kit. pH, chlorine, ammonia, nitrate. $40. Not sophisticated. Not nothing. He didn't assume. That was the thing about EOD. It beat the assumptions out of you. Every instinct that said, probably fine, or most likely nothing, had been replaced over years and deployments and devices that either killed you or didn't, with a single operating principle. Test it. Don't guess. Don't hope. Don't assume. Test it. Back at the creek, he pulled on latex gloves. A habit from a life where touching the wrong thing with bare hands meant not having hands anymore, and filled the sample vials the way the kit instructed. Methodical, step by step. No assumptions. The pH strip came back wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not the kind of wrong that screamed, the kind that whispered. A reading that sat just outside the normal range, tilting towards something acidic that shouldn't be there. Not in this water, not this time of year, not with this soil composition. Titan sat 3 feet from the water's edge, watching. He hadn't moved closer since morning. "Yeah, I see it too." Declan walked the bank downstream, Titan tracking beside him, nose low but never dipping toward the water. The dog moved along the edge like a surveyor marking a boundary he refused to cross. 100 yards down, where the creek widened into a shallow flat before the marsh took over, Declan found them. Fish. Small ones. Bream, maybe a few shiners, scattered along the muddy shelf where the current slowed. Not many, a dozen, maybe 15, pale bellies up, mouths open in that surprised expression that dead fish always wore, as if death had interrupted a conversation. In high summer, a fish kill could mean heat, low oxygen, 100 natural things. But this was late April. The water was cool. The spring rains had been generous. He crouched and picked one up with his gloved hand. No visible marks, no lesions. The eyes were cloudy, but the body was recent, hours, not days. He set it back down and looked at the water moving past. Quiet, unhurried, carrying whatever it carried without any visible sign that it had changed. A voice from across the creek, up the rise where the Guidry property backed against the waterway. "That you poking around down there, Mr. Voss?" Lorraine Guidry stood on her back porch, wiping her hands on a dish towel. 72, built like a fence post, with white hair cropped close and eyes that had been keeping track of things in Sable Creek since before the highway was paved. "Morning, Mrs. Guidry." "My well water's been tasting off," she said, without preamble. The woman had never met a conversation she couldn't enter at full speed. 2 weeks now, maybe 3. Figured it was the season changing, all that rain we had in March stirring things up, but it hasn't cleared. Off how? She considered that. The dish towel went still. Like metal. Like you left a penny sitting in a glass overnight and then drank it in the morning without thinking. Declan looked down at the dead fish, then at the creek, then at Titan, who sat motionless, ears forward, tail flat against the ground. As if waiting for Declan to arrive at a conclusion the dog had reached hours ago. 2 weeks. The water had been wrong for 2 weeks, and no one had noticed. No one had connected Mrs. Guidry's metallic well to the fish floating belly up in the shallows, to the German shepherd who wouldn't drink from a creek he'd trusted every morning for 3 years. Everyone had looked at their own small piece of the problem and filed it under probably nothing. Everyone except the dog. The road was hard-packed dirt, baked pale by a sun that hung in a white sky like a coin someone had nailed to the ceiling. Heat pressed down on the suit. 85 pounds of Kevlar and ceramic plates, and a blast visor that turned the world into a narrow tunnel of focus. And the sweat ran in lines he couldn't wipe, because his hands were inside gloves designed to keep his fingers attached to his body. 30 meters ahead, the device waited, partially buried. The wire was visible, a thin copper thread running along the shoulder of the road toward a pressure plate concealed beneath a layer of gravel. Simple construction. That was the dangerous kind. The complex ones had backup systems you could trace, redundancies you could exploit, an ego in the engineering that gave you something to work with. The simple ones just killed you. The walk. That's what they called it. Not the approach, not the procedure. The walk. Because that's all it was. 1 foot in front of the other, toward something designed to end you. Slow enough to see everything. Fast enough that the window of vulnerability didn't stretch into something the Taliban could exploit. His breathing slowed, not because he wanted it to, because the training had carved grooves into his nervous system that his conscious mind no longer controlled. Inhale on 2 steps. Exhale on 2. Heart rate dropping, even as every synapse in his brain screamed that he was walking toward death and calling it work. 30 meters. 20. 15. The kitchen came back. The mug on the counter. The screen door with its loose spring. The creek outside. Tuesday morning. South Carolina. Not Helmand. Not the road. Not the suit. Declan picked up. Beaufort County Health Department. How may I direct your call? He explained. Water quality concern. Dead fish. Neighbor's well tasting metallic. Sable Creek, off Route 17, south of the old bridge, unincorporated. He was transferred. Then transferred again. Then placed on hold for 11 minutes, during which a recording told him his call was important 3 separate times, with the exact same inflection, as if importance were a thing you could automate. Environmental Services, this is Dana. He explained again, shorter this time. He'd learned in the Navy that the third time you explain something, the problem isn't clarity, it's priority. We'll send someone out when we can, Mr. Voss. We've got a backlog right now, but I'll get it into the system. Any timeline? Could be a few weeks, could be longer. Depends on staffing. Declan stood in his kitchen and stared at the phone the way a man stares at a door that's just been closed by someone who doesn't know what's on the other side. Outside, Titan lay near the porch steps, head on his paws, watching the door with an expression that looked, impossibly, like patience. A few weeks. Could be longer. Depends on staffing. He'd heard versions of that sentence before. In waiting rooms at the VA, where the fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency that harmonized with his tinnitus like a choir of small miseries. In the months after discharge, when the paperwork for his disability claim moved through the system with the urgency of a glacier contemplating retirement. He'd learned what that language meant. It meant you were in the queue. It meant the queue was long. It meant no one on the other end of the phone was going to lose sleep over your particular version of wrong. He drove back to Marlowe's. This time he bought proper supplies. Amber glass sample jars with Teflon-lined caps, a permanent marker, latex gloves in a box of 50, a small cooler, and a bag of ice. He spent 20 minutes in the parking lot, reading chain of custody protocols on his phone, cross-referencing 3 different sources until he found the standard that matched what he remembered from evidence handling in the field. Most of the language was familiar, not because he'd studied hydrology, because he'd spent 18 years handling materials that could kill you if you documented them wrong, where the difference between a conviction and a dismissal was whether you'd changed gloves between samples. Back at the creek, he worked slowly. 3 collection points. Upstream of his property, where the water entered from the north. Directly below his dock at the pool Titan had refused. And downstream, near the Guidry line, where the dead fish had collected. At each point, rinse the jar with sample water. Fill from mid-depth without disturbing the sediment. Seal without touching the rim. Label with location coordinates, date, time, water temperature. Change gloves between every sample. Ice pack in the cooler between every jar. Titan watched from the bank, not helping, not interfering, just present. The way a partner holds the perimeter while you work the device. Declan knelt at the last collection point, forearm submerged to the elbow. The water was cool against the scar tissue that ran along his left arm. The skin there was different now. Tighter in some places, ridged in others, a topography of damage that the surgeons had called remarkable healing, and Declan had called a permanent reminder of the worst day of his life. The blast that killed Petty Officer Second Class Kyle Medina had left its signature on Declan's body. The scar, the shoulder, the 40% hearing loss in his left ear that made every conversation a geometry problem. Which side to turn? Which angle gave the words the best chance of reaching the parts of his brain that still processed sound? His hands were steady. They were always steady. That was the thing about EOD. It didn't make you brave. It made you still. It carved away every unnecessary movement, every tremor, every impulse, until all that remained was the essential motion. See the device. Understand the circuit. Render it safe. Or don't, and become the reason someone else has to make the walk. These hands. Same hands that held wire cutters with a 1/4-inch margin between render safe and catastrophic detonation. Same hands that pressed against the chest of a 24-year-old kid from Corpus Christi and felt the heartbeat stop. Now they were holding a glass jar full of creek water in South Carolina, and he couldn't decide if that was progress or the longest fall he'd ever taken. He capped the last jar, wrote the label in his tight, even print, set it in the cooler, closed the lid, sat back on his heels. Titan moved closer, pressing his flank against Declan's side. The dog's warmth was a fact that required no interpretation, no analysis, no chain of custody, just contact. Yeah, I know. Gracie's Diner sat at the only intersection in Sable Creek that had a traffic light, and even that blinked yellow more often than it shone red. The building was cinder block and corrugated tin, painted white sometime in the previous decade, and left to negotiate with the salt air on its own terms since. Inside, it smelled like coffee that had been on the burner since before dawn, and bacon grease that had achieved a kind of permanence in the walls, less a smell than a texture in the air. Declan took a booth by the window. Outside, Titan lay in the shade of the truck, tongue out, watching the sidewalk with the relaxed attention of an animal that had learned to distinguish between things worth alerting to and things that were simply the world going about its business without him. "You the one been fixin' Hebert's boat?" The waitress, Gracie herself, he'd learned, though the name belonged to her grandmother, who'd opened the place in 1971, set a mug down without asking what he wanted. She was mid-50s, thick-armed, with reading glasses pushed into hair that had long ago surrendered to any particular color. "That's me. He says you're slow but good." He's not wrong about either. She lingered, not in a hurry, not making conversation, assessing. Small towns measured strangers the way the tide measured the shore. Slowly, repeatedly, looking for what held and what washed away. Declan had been here 3 years. That made him less than a stranger, more than a neighbor, and something in between that hadn't earned a word yet. "You know much about that plant upstream? Palmetto?" "Palmetto Industrial," she said. and the way she said it carried the weariness of repetition, a word worn smooth from handling. Been there 15 years. Biggest employer in the county outside the hospital and the school district. Warren Tate runs it. Tate. Good man. Sponsors the Little League team. Put a new roof on the Methodist church last year. Buys the turkeys for the food bank every Thanksgiving. His folks spend their checks in town. She paused, reading him. Why you asking? Water's been off downstream. Fishkill. Mrs. Guidry's well tastes like pennies. Something shifted behind her eyes. Not alarm. Recognition. The careful, private expression of someone hearing a thing confirmed that they'd already begun, in the quiet part of their mind, to suspect. My sister lives out past Harlow Bend, other side of the plant. She said her garden's been different this year. Tomatoes coming in wrong. Wrong how? Smaller, bitter, leaves curling in from the edges like something's pulling them back. She shrugged, picked up the coffee pot. She blamed the soil. Probably nothing. Declan noted the probably. In his experience, probably nothing was the civilian translation of, I don't want this to be something. Outside, an elderly woman in a wide sun hat had discovered Titan and was crouching beside the truck, one hand extended, the other pressed against her knee for balance. The dog accepted her attention with the practiced grace of an animal who understood that humans needed to touch things in order to trust them, and that being touched was a service he could provide without losing anything essential. The woman came inside afterward and sat at the counter 2 stools from Declan. She ordered sweet tea and told him, unprompted, the way people do in places where a good dog is a more reliable introduction than a resume, that she was Delia Rowan, retired 4th grade teacher, 31 years at Sable Creek Elementary, and that his dog had better manners than 90% of her former students. He's had more training. Military? Both of us. She nodded at that, the way women of a certain generation nod at military service. Not with the performative gratitude that made Declan's jaw tighten, but with a quiet acknowledgement that the word carried weight she didn't presume to understand fully. A man in a Palmetto industrial polo walked in, nodded to Gracie, took a seat at the far booth. Declan watched him without deciding to watch him. Habit. 18 years of entering rooms and cataloging. Exits, occupants, anomalies. The geometry of threat. Delia leaned closer. They're sending someone from the state. Environmental office. Lorraine Guidry filed a complaint. Called the county, called DHEC, called her state representative. You know Lorraine. She doesn't do anything small. When? Next week, I heard. Some kind of water specialist. Delia's smile faded. Last time the state sent someone about anything in Sable Creek, it was about the bridge pilings on Miller Road. That was 6 years ago. She lifted her tea. They came, they measured, they wrote a report. Bridge is still the same. Declan looked out the window. Titan had settled back into his spot under the truck, chin on his paws, the shade cutting a clean line across his back. The man in the Palmetto polo was eating his dinner without looking up, the posture of a man who had spent enough time in this room to be invisible in it. The state was sending someone. A water specialist, Delia had said. Someone with credentials and equipment and the authority of an institution behind them. That was either the beginning of a solution or the performance of one. And Declan had been alive long enough to know that the difference between the two often came down to a single thing: whether the person they sent actually wanted to find what was there or had already been told what not to look for. She was already at the boat ramp when Declan arrived, and that irritated him in a way he recognized as irrational, but didn't bother to correct. His creek, his samples, his problem that he'd been handling before anyone from the state knew Sable Creek existed on a map they cared about. And here she was, a woman with a state-issued lanyard and a hard-sided Pelican case full of sampling equipment, standing at the edge of his world as if she'd been sent by someone who mattered. Dr. June Calloway was younger than he'd expected. Late 30s, dark hair pulled into a knot that was already losing a slow war with the humidity. She wore field clothes that had actually seen field work, khaki pants with ground-in stains at the knees that no amount of washing would remove, a sunshirt rolled to the elbows, boots that had been resoled at least once. She moved with efficiency rather than hurry. The distinction mattered to Declan because he'd spent his career around people for whom the difference between the two was the difference between competence and theater. She noticed him before he reached the ramp. Straightened, assessed. The same quick catalog he ran on everyone: posture, hands, eyes, intent. You Declan Voss? Depends who's asking. Dr. June Calloway, DHEC. I'm here to collect samples and determine whether Mrs. Guidry's complaint warrants further investigation. She said it with the practiced smoothness of someone who had delivered that sentence enough times to file the edges off it. I already have samples. That stopped her. She looked at him fully for the first time. Not the polite scan of initial contact, but the narrower focus of someone recalculating. Samples. 3 points along the creek. Glass jars, amber, Teflon-lined caps. Temperature logged, GPS tagged, labeled with date, time, and collection depth. Stored on ice. Chain of custody documented with photographs at each step. She stared at him for a beat longer than professional courtesy required. You did chain of custody documentation. I did. With what? A pool kit and good intentions? Started with the pool kit. Got serious after the pH came back wrong. Where did you learn evidence handling like that? Declan met her eyes. They were brown, direct, and they did not look away. Same place I learned to walk toward things that could kill me. She held his gaze for a moment that sat right on the line between professional and personal. Then she looked at her own equipment, then back at him. Something in her posture recalibrated, not softening, adjusting. The way you change your approach when the person you expected to manage turns out to be someone you might have to work alongside instead. Show me. He brought the cooler from his truck. She examined the jars without touching them first, reading his labels, checking the seals, her eyes moving with the systematic attention of someone who had reviewed 1,000 samples and could tell by the handwriting alone whether the person who collected them knew what they were doing. Her eyebrows lifted once. These are admissible, she said, more to herself than to him. Then louder. I'll incorporate your samples into my official collection set. If the preliminary results flag, having independent collection points with documented chain of custody strengthens any case significantly. And if it doesn't flag? Then we have good data that says so, and everyone sleeps better. She closed the cooler lid with a click. But the fish kill, the well complaints, your dog's refusal, that's pattern, not coincidence. That's data. You believe the dog? I believe in pattern recognition. Your dog recognized a pattern before either of us did. That's the most honest kind of data there is. Titan had been sitting near the truck, observing the exchange with his usual composure, the patience of an animal who understood that humans talked more than necessary and would eventually arrive at the obvious conclusion if given enough time. Now he stood, stretched, the long, slow, full body stretch of a dog deciding to involve himself, and walked toward them. Not toward Declan, toward June. She stiffened. Not fear, unfamiliarity. The precise stillness of someone who hadn't grown up with large animals and had learned to respect their space from a careful distance. Titan stopped a foot from her, sat, looked up, ears forward, head tilted slightly, waiting. He won't bite. I didn't say I thought he would. Then let him come to you. She extended her hand, palm down, fingers loose. Titan sniffed, once, twice, then pressed his nose against her knuckles and held it there. After a moment, his tail swept the gravel once. Slow, definitive. He's calm for a military dog. He's calm because I'm calm. June pulled her phone from her back pocket, read the screen, typed something rapid with one thumb. Field test on my samples is back. Elevated industrial compounds, chlorinated solvents specifically, 4 times the acceptable threshold for this watershed classification. Declan turned and looked upstream, past the boat ramp, past the cypress trees that leaned over the water like tired sentries, past the bend where the creek narrowed and the banks rose higher and the tree canopy closed overhead. Somewhere beyond that canopy, 12 miles up the watershed, a plant that employed 120 people and sponsored the Little League and put a roof on a church, sat on the bank of the same water that was killing fish and souring wells and making tomatoes come in bitter. Source is upstream. Direction of the plant. June snapped her case shut. She didn't look up. Yeah. I know. Warren Tate didn't look like a villain. That was the first thing Declan noticed, and the fact that he noticed it was itself a warning. 18 years in EOD had taught him that the devices designed to look harmless carried the highest body count. It was the IEDs that looked like the road. Same color, same texture, same ordinary nothing that killed you. The dramatic ones, the ones that announced themselves, those were the ones you survived. It was the quiet ones that got you. Tate walked into Gracie's at 6:15 on a Thursday evening with the ease of a man who owned the rhythm of the room without needing to prove it. Mid-50s, broad through the shoulders, silver threading through dark hair at the temples in a way that read as authority rather than age. His shirt was pressed but not stiff. His boots were clean but not new. Everything about him was calibrated to say, I belong here. I work here. I am one of you. His handshake, when he extended it, was firm and warm and lasted exactly the right amount of time. Mr. Voss, Warren Tate. I manage Palmetto Industrial. Figured it was time we met face to face. I know who you are. Then you know I care about this community. Mind if I sit? He was already sitting when Declan didn't answer, which told Declan everything the handshake hadn't. I understand you've been asking questions about the water, Warren said. No defensiveness, no edge. The tone of a man bringing a conversation he'd been preparing for. Frankly, I'm glad someone's paying attention. We should all care about the creek. It's why most of us live out here. You came to tell me that? I came to be transparent. He reached into a leather portfolio and slid a stack of papers across the table. Clean, organized, tabbed with colored flags. Compliance reports, EPA, DHEC, State Environmental Board, every quarter for the last 3 years. We're below the legal threshold on every metric they measure. Every single one. Declan looked at the reports. The numbers were clean. The formatting was professional. The signatures were official. Column after column of measurements that said, we tested, we passed, we documented, we are doing everything right. You brought these prepared. I believe in getting ahead of concern before it becomes something bigger than it needs to be. He leaned back slightly, a practiced gesture of openness, the body language equivalent of showing empty hands. This community can't afford division right now. You know that. Half the families in this county have someone working at that plant. We're not the enemy here. You and me, Warren continued, voice dropping half a register into something that was meant to feel like confidence. We're the same. Just two men trying to keep something running in a place that doesn't always make it easy. I imagine a man with your background understands that. My background? Navy, right? I respect that. All I'm saying is, you know what it's like to operate in an environment where everyone's watching, and most of them don't understand what you're actually doing. Titan, lying near the door where Gracie tolerated him because he was cleaner and quieter than most of her evening regulars, lifted his head. The growl was barely audible, more vibration than sound, a frequency that lived below conversation, the kind of warning that only someone who knew the animal would catch. His eyes were fixed on Warren. Easy. The dog's head lowered, but his eyes didn't move. Warren glanced at the dog, then back at Declan. His smile didn't waver. Beautiful animal. Mr. Tate. Declan folded his hands on the table. People who need you to trust them usually have a reason. The smile held for another half second. Then it shifted, not disappearing, restructuring, the way a hand rearranges its cards without showing you which ones moved. I understand the skepticism, Warren said. You're new here. You hear some noise about the plant, figure the company must be hiding something. I'd think the same thing in your position. I've been here 3 years. That's new, Warren said, and there was no malice in it, just the quiet authority of a man who had been keeping score longer. Give it 10, then we'll talk. He stood, buttoned his jacket with one hand, a gesture that said the conversation was ending on his schedule. Extended his hand again. Declan shook it. Same calibrated grip, same practiced warmth. My door's always open. Anything you want to see at the plant, you call my office. Full transparency. That's how we do things. Declan sat with the compliance reports spread on the table. The numbers were clean. The paperwork was flawless. Every page, every figure, every signature looked exactly the way it should. Titan moved from the door and pressed his head against Declan's thigh. The growl was gone, but the dog's body held a tension that hadn't been there before Warren Tate walked in, and wouldn't fully leave now that he'd gone. The most dangerous device Declan had ever encountered was a daisy-chained IED on a road outside a village in Helmand Province. Two pressure plates wired in sequence. The first one small, designed to wound, to stop movement, to draw people in. The second one larger, buried 8 meters to the left, positioned where the medic would kneel, where the team would gather, where the instinct to help would put the most people in the smallest space. 3 teams had cleared that road before his. Each one had looked at it and seen what the builder wanted them to see. A road that looked like a road. An ordinary stretch of nothing. It killed 2 Marines and a Navy corpsman before Declan's team found the second device, still armed, still waiting, still looking exactly like the ground around it. He closed the folder. Everything looks right. He scratched behind Titan's ear, slow, the way he always did when the world was asking him a question he wasn't ready to answer. That's what worries me. The John boat rode low in the water, weighed down by 2 people, a dog, and a cooler full of empty sample jars. Declan kept the outboard throttled back, reading the creek the way he'd once read approach lanes, scanning the surface for changes in texture, color, the way light moved across the current and revealed or concealed what was underneath. June sat forward, a GPS unit in one hand and a folded topographic map in the other, cross-referencing coordinates with the ease of someone who had spent more time on waterways than in offices. The clipboard was gone. The lanyard was tucked inside her shirt. Out here, she was different. Less bureaucrat, more field scientist. The distinction mattered. Titan lay between them, body pressed flat against the hull's warm aluminum, chin resting on the gunnel. He watched the water pass without concern, the way a dog watches a thing it has decided to tolerate rather than trust. Occasionally, his ears would rotate toward a sound in the trees, a heron lifting, a fish jumping, the rustle of something moving through palmetto scrub, and then return to their default position, forward and slightly angled, attentive without alarm. This tributary feeds in from the northwest, June said, tracing a line on the map without looking up. It runs within half a mile of Palmetto's property before it joins the main channel. If the contamination is direct discharge, this feeder is the most likely vector. Not the main creek? Too visible, too monitored. If someone's dumping deliberately, they'd use a secondary channel. Less traffic, less oversight. Harder to trace without... She caught herself, looked up. Without someone who knows what to look for. How does it work? Declan asked. Not because he needed to understand hydrology to do what he was doing. Because he needed to understand the person sitting 4 feet away from him. And people revealed themselves most clearly when they talked about the thing they knew best. June set the map down and turned slightly toward him, and he turned with her, angling his right ear forward without thinking about it. The automatic geometry of a man who had lost 40% of his hearing on one side and compensated so instinctively that most people never noticed. She noticed. Her eyes moved to his left ear, then back to his face, and she didn't ask. That mattered. The Low Country watershed is a braided system, she said, not a single channel. It's dozens of creeks and tributaries feeding into each other, sharing groundwater, sharing sediment, sharing whatever's in the water, including contaminants. If you introduce a pollutant at one point, it doesn't stay put. It migrates. Through the surface water, yes, but also through the water table, through the soil, through the root systems of every plant that touches the bank. She traced the map with her finger, the web of blue lines that spread across the topography like veins. The marsh is alive. Everything's connected. You poison one part, and the whole system carries it, like a circuit. She looked at him. What? In EOD, the first thing you learn is that every device is a circuit. Wire, power source, detonator, payload. You can't understand any one part without understanding how it connects to every other part. Cut the wrong wire, and the whole thing goes off. Follow the right one, and you find the source. That's... She stopped, tilted her head. That's actually exactly what this is. An environmental circuit. And someone bypassed the safety mechanism. Declan turned the boat toward the tributary mouth. The vegetation thickened here, Spanish moss hanging low enough to brush against their shoulders, water hyacinth closing the surface into a green mat that the hull pushed through with a sound like wet paper tearing. The air changed too. Heavier, warmer, carrying something underneath the usual marsh smell that sat at the back of the throat like a question you couldn't quite form. He killed the motor, let the boat drift. Here, June said. She was already pulling on gloves, reaching for the sampling equipment. Smell that? He did. Faint, chemical. Not the organic tang of decomposition or the mineral sharpness of clay. Something thinner, cleaner, in a way that didn't belong. Industrial. She collected 3 samples in rapid succession, each one drawn from a different depth, each one labeled with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times, but understood that the 1,001st might be the one that mattered. Concentration here is roughly 8 times the acceptable limit. She held a vial up to the filtered light. The water looked no different than the water downstream. Clear, faintly amber, carrying the reflected green of the canopy above. This isn't runoff. This isn't seepage. This is direct discharge. Someone opened a valve, Declan said. Someone opened a valve, June confirmed, and they're still opening it. They sat in the quiet for a moment. The boat drifted, turning slowly in the current. The trees pressed in from both sides, and the sky was visible only in patches, a jigsaw of blue and white cut into fragments by the canopy. Titan lifted his head from the gunwale and set it down on June's thigh. She stiffened, the same careful stillness from the boat ramp, and then, slowly, let her hand rest on the dog's neck. Her fingers found the ridge of muscle behind his ear, and Titan's eyes half closed in a way that Declan had only ever seen directed at him. He doesn't do that with everyone. June looked at him. Something in her expression shifted, not quite a smile, closer to a question she chose not to ask. Then I'll take it as a compliment. The boat had drifted into the shallows. Declan reached for the push pole and guided them back toward the center of the channel. He heard it before he saw it. An engine, idling somewhere on the access road that paralleled the upper tributary, the gravel track that led eventually to Palmetto Industrial's back gate. Through a gap in the trees, he caught it. A white pickup, clean, parked at the road's edge where the bank dropped toward the water. Someone stood beside it, not moving, just watching. Too far to make out features, close enough to be seen. Close enough that being seen was the point. Titan's head came up. The growl lasted 2 seconds, then stopped. Not because the threat had passed, but because the dog had cataloged it and filed it under things to remember. "Who's that?" June asked, following Declan's gaze. "Someone making sure we know they're watching." The truck sat for another 30 seconds. Then the engine revved, gravel crunched, and it pulled away. No hurry, no stealth. The casual withdrawal of someone who had accomplished what they came to do. June looked at Declan. Her expression had changed. The field scientist was gone, replaced by something harder. The expression of a woman who had seen this particular play before, in a different state, with different water, and knew exactly what the second act looked like. Should we be worried? We should be careful. The last of the daylight caught the marsh grass in long amber lines, and for a moment, just a moment, the water, the light, the dog, and the quiet felt like something Declan didn't have a name for. Something he hadn't earned, and maybe didn't deserve, but was beginning, against his better judgment, to want. They found the pipe 2 days later. Declan had been working the tributary bank for hours, moving on foot now. The boat pulled up at a bend where the water narrowed to a channel barely wider than his arm span. June was 50 meters behind, marking GPS coordinates on a secondary device, triangulating the concentration gradient they'd been following upstream, like a trail of breadcrumbs laid in parts per million. Titan worked the bank ahead of both of them, nose low, moving with the systematic patience of an animal trained to detect things humans couldn't see or smell or understand. He hadn't been trained for chemical detection. His MWD specialty had been explosives, but the instinct was the same. Follow the scent. Trust the scent. Let the handler catch up. The dog stopped. Not the gradual slowing of uncertainty, the clean, definitive halt of contact. He stood rigid, one paw lifted, head angled toward a section of bank where the mud had been disturbed. Not recently disturbed by weather or animals. Deliberately disturbed. Reshaped. The kind of disturbance that said, someone was here, and they didn't want you to know. What do you have? Declan crouched beside Titan and looked where the dog was looking. At first, mud. Roots. The compressed tangle of vegetation that accumulates where water meets land and neither wins. Then, underneath the layer of palm fronds that had been arranged, not fallen, with a care that was itself a confession. Metal. A pipe. Galvanized steel, maybe 4 inches in diameter, running from the bank into the water at a shallow angle. The end was submerged, positioned below the waterline where the current would carry whatever came out of it downstream before the surface showed any sign. The installation was careful, practiced. Not a temporary fix, a system. Declan didn't touch it. That instinct was carved deeper than any civilian concern. You don't touch the device until you understand the circuit. Instead, he pulled out his phone and photographed it from 4 angles, each with the GPS coordinates visible on the screen. He noted the pipe diameter, the angle of entry, the direction it pointed, upstream, toward the northwest, toward the property line of Palmetto Industrial. June arrived, breathing slightly harder from the terrain. She saw the pipe, stopped. Her jaw tightened in a way that told Declan this wasn't the first time she'd seen something like this. Just the first time she'd hoped she wouldn't. That's a direct discharge line. No question in it. No ambiguity. Deliberately installed. Deliberately concealed. How long? She crouched, examined the connection point where the pipe met the bank. The corrosion pattern suggests at least 2 years, maybe 3. This isn't recent. This is routine. I need to report this. So report it. She called DHEC from the bank of the tributary, with mud on her boots and mosquitoes circling her wrists and a pipe at her feet that proved everything she'd been sent here to determine. Declan listened to her side of the conversation. Clear, professional, escalating in urgency with each response she received. Yes, I understand the process. I'm telling you what I'm looking at. No, this isn't a preliminary finding. This is a direct discharge line feeding into a residential watershed. I understand. I'll document and submit through the standard channel. They'll review it, she said. The words came out flat, not angry, emptied. Standard timeline. Could be weeks. You expected something different? She didn't answer. She was looking at the pipe, at the water moving past it, at the trees that hid it from any angle except the one you'd only find if you were specifically, stubbornly, unreasonably looking. You've seen this before, Declan said. Not a question, a recognition. The way one person who has been through a particular kind of failure recognizes it in another. June's hands were still. Her eyes were not. Yes, I have. The forest was going dark around them. Titan pressed against Declan's leg, and somewhere upstream, where the trees were thicker and the money was bigger, and the compliance reports were cleaner than the water, a pipe continued to do what it had been built to do. The porch was the only place Declan could sit without the walls pressing in on him. Inside the cabin, the rooms were small enough that his shoulders knew where the door frames were without looking, and the ceiling was low enough that the air felt used. Outside, the marsh opened up in every direction, and the sky was larger than anything that could be contained, and the ringing in his left ear could lose itself in the sound of frogs and insects, and the creek doing what the creek did, whether anyone was listening or not. June sat in the other chair, the one Declan had bought at a yard sale 3 months after he moved in, telling himself it was for the porch and not for a person, knowing that buying a second chair was either optimism or denial, and not caring which. She held a glass of water from the jug he kept in the refrigerator now, not the tap, not the well, the jug, and she turned it slowly in her hands without drinking. Titan lay between them, body stretched across the porch boards, his head resting exactly midway between their 2 chairs, not choosing sides, holding the middle. 4 years ago, June said. Declan didn't move, didn't prompt, didn't do any of the things that people do when they sense a confession coming. The lean forward, the encouraging nod, the verbal invitation to continue. He simply waited. It was the thing he was best at, and the thing that cost him the most. I was in Georgia. Small community outside Augusta. Rural. Maybe 600 people. Agricultural mostly. Pecan farms, some cattle. They filed a complaint about their well water. Multiple families. Headaches, skin rashes. One child with recurring nosebleeds that nobody could explain. I went down, took samples, ran the panels. She stared at the glass in her hands, as if it contained the past, and she was trying to decide whether to drink it or pour it out. The results were clear. Contamination from an industrial solvent used in a manufacturing process at a facility 3 miles upstream. Same kind of pipe, same kind of concealment, same pattern. What happened? I wrote the report, documented everything. Chain of custody, concentration levels, health correlations, the discharge point, all of it. Submitted it to my supervisor. He called me into his office 3 days later, told me the facility was a major employer, told me the report needed to be revised to reflect inconclusive findings, told me the political landscape was complicated, told me I was early in my career and that learning when to push and when to step back was part of the job. And I did it. The words sat in the air between them, like something set down on a table that neither of them could pick up. I filed the version they told me to file. Inconclusive. Recommended further monitoring. No enforcement action. 2 years later, 14 people in that community were diagnosed with health conditions linked to chronic chemical exposure. A child, the one with the nosebleeds, developed a neurological condition. The facility was eventually shut down, but by then, she stopped. Her hands were no longer turning the glass. They were still, the knuckles white. By then, the damage was done, and my name was on the report that said there was nothing to find. Declan looked at the marsh. The light was almost gone now, just a thin amber line where the sky met the tree line, and the rest was the blue-gray of a low-country evening settling into itself. He thought about Kyle Medina, about a road in Helmand Province, and a voice on the radio saying clear, and a 24-year-old kid stepping to the position his chief had told him to hold. Stand there, Medina. Right there. The second device detonated 14 seconds later. Everyone freezes once. That was the thing they didn't tell you in training. Not at Great Lakes, not at Eglin, not anywhere in the pipeline that turned civilians into technicians who could walk toward death at a controlled heart rate. They trained you for the device. They trained you for the wire, the circuit, the blast radius. What they didn't train you for was the moment after. The moment when you realize that your best judgment, your training, your 18 years of getting it right had, in one irreversible instant, gotten it wrong. Everybody freezes once, he said. His voice was low, stripped of anything that could be mistaken for comfort. Not because he didn't feel it, but because comfort wasn't what she needed. What she needed was the truth delivered without decoration. What you do the second time is what counts. June looked at him. Her eyes were wet, but the tears didn't fall, held by the same discipline that had kept her voice steady through the confession, the same refusal to let the emotion become the thing instead of remaining what it was, evidence of a wound that hadn't healed because she hadn't let anyone see it long enough to treat it. Is that what you tell yourself? Every day. Titan lifted his head and placed it on June's knee. Not her hand, her knee. The full weight of it, deliberate, present, the kind of contact that didn't ask for anything in return. Her hand came down to rest on the dog's head. Her fingers curled into the fur behind his ears, and something in her posture released. Not collapsing, just allowing. The way a wall allows ivy to grow on it when it's tired of standing alone. Declan watched. He didn't say anything. Didn't reach out. Didn't close the distance between the two chairs that felt, at that moment, both impossibly wide and exactly right. June stood, set the glass on the railing. Her hand brushed against Declan's as she reached for the rail, and she paused. Just for a fraction of a second, just long enough for both of them to feel the contact and decide, separately and simultaneously, not to acknowledge it. Last time I had the evidence, and I stayed quiet. This time? She looked out at the marsh, at the water she couldn't see but could hear, at the dark line of trees that hid a pipe that was still, at this very moment, doing what it had been built to do. This time, I'm here. He woke to the growl. Not the full-throated warning Titan saved for genuine threats, the one that came from the chest and vibrated through the floor, but the quieter version, the one that lived in the throat and said, I hear something you don't. I'm not sure yet, but I'm not letting it go. Declan opened his eyes. The cabin was dark, the only light a thin strip of moon falling through the window above the sink. Titan was standing beside the bed, body rigid, head oriented toward the back of the cabin, toward the door that led to the shed and the creek beyond. What is it? The sound was wrong. Not the house settling, not the wind. A weight on the back steps. The specific complaint of the third board from the bottom, the one Declan had been meaning to replace because it announced every arrival and departure like a wooden doorbell. Someone was on the steps, or had been. The board creaked once and then was silent, which meant whoever made the sound had heard it too and stopped moving. Declan swung his legs off the bed. No light. No sudden movement. 18 years of responding to intrusions had taught him that the first 3 seconds determined everything. If you announced yourself, you gave up position. If you panicked, you gave up control. If you moved carefully and let the silence work for you, you kept both. He moved to the kitchen. Titan followed, a shadow pressed against his leg, the growl now continuous, but low enough to be felt rather than heard. Declan reached the back door. It was closed, locked. The deadbolt he'd installed the first week he moved in, not because he expected trouble, but because locks were the one thing from his previous life that still made sense. He checked the knob. The deadbolt held. But below the knob, at the level of the lock plate, a thin scratch ran across the brass. Fresh, bright against the tarnished surface. Someone had worked the lock with a tool. Not a key, a pick, or a shim, or something thin enough to reach the mechanism without leaving anything behind except this one mark that said, I was here. I tried. I might try again. Declan stood at the door for a long time after the sound faded. Then he turned the deadbolt and opened it. The back porch was empty. The steps were empty. The dirt path that led to the shed and the creek showed nothing in the dark that his eyes could read. But Titan pushed past him, nose to the ground, and traced a line from the steps to the side of the cabin and around to where the truck was parked, and then stopped at the edge of the gravel where tire marks pressed into the soft shoulder of the road. Fresh. Deep enough that the vehicle had been heavy. Not a car. A truck. Yeah. He went back inside, checked the kitchen. The laptop, the old ThinkPad he used for invoices and weather and nothing else that mattered, was gone. The counter where he'd left it was bare, a clean rectangle in the thin layer of dust. The cooler in the refrigerator. He opened it. The backup samples, 3 jars he'd kept separate from the ones he'd given June, were still there. But the lids were loose, unsealed. When he lifted one, the jar was empty, poured out. The others the same. His notes. The legal pad where he'd written the timeline, the coordinates, Mrs. Guidry's statement, the fish kill dates. Gone. The folder of photographs he'd printed at the library in Beaufort. Gone. A memory rose, unbidden. A forward operating base in Kandahar Province, 2012. 3 a.m. The perimeter alarm hadn't triggered, but Declan woke anyway. The way you wake when the air in the room changes because a door has been opened that shouldn't be open. He'd rolled out of his rack with the sidearm already in his hand, finger indexed along the frame, and found a shadow retreating through the maintenance corridor. They never identified the intruder. The CO logged it as a security event. They doubled the watch. But the feeling remained. That particular violation of knowing someone had been in your space while you slept, had moved through your world without permission, had touched your things and breathed your air and left nothing behind except the knowledge that they could do it again. Declan's hands were shaking. Not much, not enough that anyone watching would have noticed. But he noticed, and Titan noticed, and that was enough. The dog pressed against his leg, not the casual lean of companionship, the deliberate, full-body press of an animal applying weight to a person who needed to be held to the ground. They want me to know. He sat in the dark kitchen with his back against the counter and his dog against his chest and stared at the space where the laptop had been. Not a theft, a message. Take what you have, destroy what you've gathered, show you how easy it is to reach you, and hope that's enough to make you stop. It's not enough. Titan's ear flicked. The dog looked up, steady, unblinking. Not even close. Declan didn't sleep. He drove into town at first light, Titan riding shotgun with his head out the window, the morning air pulling his ears back in long, undignified ripples that made him look, for a moment, less like a former military working dog and more like what he also was, just a dog enjoying the wind. He found Ray Thibodeau at the fish dock, mending a cast net with hands that moved through the mesh the way water moved through the marsh, without thinking, without stopping, without any apparent relationship between effort and result. Ray was 64, skin the color and texture of a leather satchel that had spent decades in the sun, and he had been fishing these waters since before Palmetto Industrial existed. Ray. Voss. How's the catch? Down 40% from last year, he said, the way a man delivers a weather report about a storm that already hit. Shrimp are gone from the upper creek entirely. Used to pull 20 pounds a run from the flats above the Guidry line. This season, I'm pulling 6. On a good day. Most days, it's less. When did it change? Gradual. Last 2-3 years. Everybody said it was the cycles, water temperature, tidal patterns, the usual excuses people make when they don't want to name the thing, because naming it means doing something about it. He tied off a knot, tested it with a sharp pull, nodded to himself. But cycles come back. The crabs come back. The shrimp come back. The bream follow the shrimp, and the reds follow the bream, and the whole chain rebuilds itself like it's done for 100 years. This didn't come back. The chain broke and stayed broke. You think it's the plant. Ray looked at him for the first time since the conversation started. His eyes were the washed blue of a man who had spent 50 years squinting into the glare off water. I think that when a man's been fishing the same creek his whole life, and the creek stops feeding him, he's got 2 choices. He can blame the creek, or he can look at what changed upstream. The creek didn't change. The creek is the creek. Declan sat on an overturned bucket. Titan settled beside him, and within 30 seconds, a dock worker's daughter, 7, maybe 8, was kneeling in front of the dog, scratching his chest with both hands, while Titan endured it with the dignity of a retired general submitting to a preschool portrait session. He's a good dog, mister. He knows. Mrs. Guidry was at the post office when Declan walked through town. She flagged him down the way she flagged down everything, with the complete confidence of a woman who believed that the world's problems could be solved if people would just stand still long enough to hear about them. My granddaughter, Keely, she swam in the creek 2 weeks ago, that stretch behind the Robichaux place, and she's had a rash up both arms ever since. Doctor says contact dermatitis. I say the water's making our children sick, and someone better start saying so out loud. I'm saying so. Then say it louder. June's name on the screen. He stepped away from Mrs. Guidry and took the call. My supervisor called this morning, June said. No greeting, no preamble. Her voice was tight in a way that Declan recognized. The tension of someone holding something back, not because they want to, but because letting it go would cost more than keeping it. They've classified my report as preliminary, pending further review, which means it sits in the queue until someone decides it's worth acting on. How long? Months? Maybe longer? This is what it looks like, Declan. This is exactly what it looked like before. He looked down the street, at Gracie's with its tin roof catching the morning sun, at the hardware store, at the dock where Ray Thibodeau's nets hung drying, and a little girl was telling a German shepherd about her day. At a town that was being poisoned in increments small enough that each one, by itself, could be called probably nothing. Then we do it differently. How? We don't wait for the system. We build the case ourselves. Community data. Every fisherman logs their catch. Every resident reports their water quality. Every parent documents every rash, every headache, every... He stopped, drew a breath. We build a record they can't file away. That's not how this works. That's how it works when the way it works doesn't work. All right, June said, not enthusiastic, not reluctant, decided. All right. He spent the rest of the day going door to door. Not every door, just the ones that mattered. The fishermen who had numbers, the parents who had children with symptoms, the old-timers who remembered what the creek used to look like and could testify with the authority of people who had lived in one place long enough to become instruments of measurement to the difference. At the Robichaux place, a mother showed him the rash on her son's arms, red, raised, in a pattern that followed the waterline of the creek where the boy swam every summer. At the Hebert property, Old Man Hebert, the same Hebert whose boat Declan had been fixing for 3 months, pulled him aside and said, "My well's been off since February. I didn't want to say anything because I didn't want to make trouble. But trouble's already here, isn't it?" "Yeah, it is." "Then what do you need from me?" "Dates. Write down when it started, what it smells like, anything you notice that changed." The old man nodded, not happy, not frightened, just the steady acknowledgement of a man who had lived long enough to know that trouble, once named, had to be dealt with, whether you wanted to or not. At the Thibodeau cousins' place, a double-wide set back from the road behind a stand of live oaks whose branches had grown together overhead like the fingers of 2 hands clasping, a woman named Claire showed him a gallon jug of tap water she'd been saving. She held it up to the light the way June had held the sample vial on the tributary, and in the pale afternoon sun, the water carried a faint yellowish cast that didn't belong there. "It wasn't like that in January," she said. "I know because I canned tomatoes in January and the water was clear. It changed around February, maybe March." "You're sure about the timing?" "I'm sure because that's when my youngest stopped drinking the water. Said it tasted funny. I told him he was being dramatic." She set the jug down on the porch rail with a care that seemed disproportionate to its contents, but wasn't. He wasn't being dramatic. Declan wrote down the dates, the names, the symptoms. Each house added a line to a timeline that was becoming, with every conversation, less a collection of individual complaints and more a map. A map of contamination spreading through a community the way a circuit spreads current. From the source, through every connected node until the whole system carried the charge. At the Bellamy place, a shrimper named Dale, who hadn't spoken more than 12 words to Declan in 3 years of living a quarter-mile apart, looked at Titan, sitting on his porch, and said, "That dog yours?" "He is." "Good dog. The best." Dale was quiet for a long time. Then, "My boy's got lesions on his feet. Doctor says fungal. I say he's been wading in the creek since he was 4 and never had fungal anything. Changed this year. You got a piece of paper? I'll write it down." Titan went with him to every door, and something happened that Declan hadn't anticipated and couldn't have orchestrated. The dog, this scarred, serious, 85-pound remnant of a military program and a dead handler's last wish, became the thing that opened doors that Declan's presence alone could not. Children ran to him. Grandmothers offered him biscuits from tins that appeared as if conjured by the sound of his collar jingling on the porch. Suspicious men on porches who looked at Declan with the flat assessment reserved for outsiders softened when Titan sat at their feet and looked up with those steady brown eyes that said, "I am not here to judge. I am here because he is here, and he is here because something is wrong. By the time the sun dropped behind the live oaks, Declan had 14 families committed to keeping records. Ray Thibodeau had agreed to organize the fishermen. Mrs. Guidry had appointed herself coordinator of well water complaints, a role she had arguably been performing without title for weeks. Declan drove home in the last of the light. Titan sat in the passenger seat, head tipped against the window, eyes half closed. The road was empty. The marsh stretched out on both sides, turning gold and then orange, and then the deep, bruised purple that the low country wore in the minutes before full dark. The cabin was ahead. He turned into the drive, headlights sweeping across the packed dirt, and saw them. Tire tracks, fresh, deep, pressed into the shoulder of the road near the shed, where no vehicle he recognized had any reason to be. Titan was upright in the seat, ears forward, body rigid. I see them. He went back on the water. That was the thing about Declan, that he understood about himself and didn't particularly like. The part that responded to threats not by retreating, but by pressing forward. Not because he was brave, but because stopping felt like a form of surrender that his body refused to accept, even when his mind made perfectly reasonable arguments in its favor. The John boat moved slowly up the tributary. Same route, same low throttle, same careful reading of the current, but different now. The tire tracks at his cabin, the lock scratches, the emptied jars and missing laptop. Every mile upstream was a mile further from safety, and he knew it, the way he knew the ringing in his left ear, as a constant, as a condition, as the price of being where he was. Titan rode in the bow, stance wide, ears rotating. Not the lazy surveillance of their first trip. This was different. This was the dog Declan had known in a different life. Alert, professional, reading the environment for signals that existed below the frequency of human perception. He reached the sampling zone near the pipe. Cut the engine. Drifted. Began the collection routine. Gloves, jars, labels. His hands moved through the protocol with the mechanical precision of repetition. Each step burned into muscle memory from a career where the protocol was the only thing between you and the thing that could end you. One more set, he muttered, reaching over the starboard side for the final collection depth. He heard it before he identified it. A sound that didn't belong. Not a boat engine, not wildlife. Something mechanical and deliberate, coming from behind him, from the direction of the main channel. He turned his head, left ear toward the sound, which meant the right ear, the good ear, was pointed away, which meant the sound was already closer than it seemed. The boat shifted. Not a rock. He knew every submerged obstacle on this waterway. Not current. The flow here was too gentle to push a loaded John boat sideways. Something underneath. Something wrong. Water came through the transom drain. Fast. Not the slow seepage of a worn plug. The sudden, purposeful ingress of a boat whose drain plug had been removed or whose hull had been compromised while it sat on the trailer overnight. He looked down. The water was rising around his boots, climbing the cooler, finding the sample jars, and lifting them in their foam cradle. The fuel line. He grabbed for the outboard, hit the starter. Nothing. Pulled again. Dead. He traced the line with his hand and found the cut, clean, deliberate, a blade taken to the rubber tubing where it connected to the tank. Not chewed, not cracked. Cut. The boat was going down. Not fast. There was time, maybe 2 minutes before the waterline reached the gunnels. But the current was already doing its work, pulling the sinking hull downstream, away from the bank, into the deeper stretch of the tributary, where the bottom dropped to 6 or 7 feet, and the current ran faster than it looked. Declan kicked off his boots, left shoulder screaming, right knee locking. He grabbed the cooler, the samples, the last physical evidence he had, and went over the side. The water was warmer than he expected, and darker, and the current found him immediately. Not violent, but relentless. The steady pull of a force that didn't care whether you were ready for it. His left arm wouldn't cooperate. The shoulder that had been grinding for 4 years chose this moment to declare its full objection. The pain, a white sheet, pulled across his vision that turned the world into a negotiation between what his body could do and what the water demanded. He kicked. The right knee locked, released, locked again. The joint screaming the same protest it had screamed on every patrol, every exfil, every midnight scramble from rack to ready. In a world where the human body was a tool you used until it broke, and then used some more. The cooler, the samples. He reached for it with his right hand, felt his fingers close on the handle, felt the weight of the evidence inside, the last physical proof of what Palmetto was doing. Carefully collected, carefully labeled, the product of discipline and training, and the stubborn refusal to let a problem remain invisible. The current caught the cooler sideways. The handle, wet and smooth, slid through his grip the way certainty slides through your hands when the world decides it doesn't owe you the outcome you planned for. Gone, downstream, sinking, becoming part of the evidence it was meant to preserve. Water samples returning to the water, dissolving into the creek like a secret told to the thing it was about. His left ear was underwater. Silence on that side. The permanent silence he'd carried since Helmand. And on the right, a roar that was partly current, and partly his own breathing, and partly the tinnitus screaming at a frequency that turned the inside of his skull into a place he couldn't stay, but couldn't leave. Titan hit the water from the bank like a projectile. 85 pounds of muscle and purpose, and the kind of loyalty that doesn't calculate cost because it was never taught to. The dog closed the distance in seconds, swimming with a power that made a mockery of the aging joints, the stiff mornings, the careful way he took the porch steps. All of that was gone, replaced by something older and deeper and fiercer. The drive of an animal that has lost one person it was bonded to, and has made, in whatever wordless chamber of the canine heart where such decisions are forged, the determination that it will not lose another. Declan felt the fur before he saw the dog, felt the solid, moving mass of animal beside him, felt Titan's shoulder press against his chest, the way the dog had pressed against his leg 100 times on 100 porches and 100 dark nights. Not gently, not carefully, but with the full committed weight of a creature that understood, without language, without training, without anything except the bond between them, that the man needed to be held to something solid, or the current would take him.
I got you. I got you. He didn't know who he was talking to. The dog, himself. Kyle Medina, 24 years old, standing exactly where Declan told him to stand, trusting the chief the way everyone trusted the chief, because the chief was always right. Except once. His fingers found the collar, his right hand locked around it, and his left arm hung useless, and Titan pulled. The dog pulled against the current, against the weight, against the water that was trying to take one more thing from a man who had already given more than anyone should be asked to give. Declan lay on the bank with his face in the mud, and the dog on top of him. Titan's chest heaving against his back, the wet fur pressed against his neck. The sky was visible through the trees. Blue, ordinary, indifferent. The road outside the village. Dust, heat, the walk. 30 meters. 20. 15. The second device, the one he didn't know about, the one no one knew about, positioned 8 meters to the left, at the exact spot where he'd told Medina to stand. Stand there, Medina. Right there. You're good. The sound came through years, through water, through the mud against his face and the dog on his back, and the creek that kept moving as if nothing had happened, because for the creek, nothing had. Every time, Declan whispered into the dirt. Every time I try to hold something. He couldn't finish, not because the words weren't there, but because finishing them would make them true in a way that leaving them unfinished didn't. Titan shifted, pressed harder. 85 pounds of anchor. The dog's nose found Declan's ear, the left one, the damaged one, the one that heard only silence and the ringing that never stopped, and pressed against it, warm, wet, present. The samples were gone. The laptop was gone. June was suspended. The compliance reports were clean. The system was working exactly the way it was designed to work, slowly enough that the damage could be done before anyone with authority decided it mattered. Declan lay on the bank of a creek in South Carolina with nothing left. No evidence, no allies in the system, no resources, no plan. Just a dog. Wet, breathing, refusing to move. Okay. The word came out of him like air from a punctured tire. Slow, involuntary, the sound of something that had been holding pressure, finally letting go. Okay, buddy. Okay. The porch held him the way it always did, without judgment, without expectation, without asking him to be anything other than the shape he currently occupied, which, tonight, was the shape of a man who had been pulled from a creek by a dog and driven home in wet clothes and sat down on the top step and hadn't found a reason to stand back up. The mud had dried on his jeans, stiffening the fabric around his knees in a way that cracked when he shifted, and reminded him, with each small movement, of where he'd been and what had happened there. His left arm hung at his side, the shoulder radiating a dull, persistent heat that wasn't warmth, but damage. The rotator cuff that had been grinding for 4 years, announcing, with the quiet authority of a machine past its service life, that it had reached a point of negotiation from which it did not intend to retreat. The tinnitus was louder than usual. Or maybe the world was quieter. Or maybe the distinction between the two had collapsed in the hours since the water, since the current, since the feeling of the cooler handle sliding through his fingers, and the last physical evidence of what Palmetto Industrial was doing to this watershed, sinking into the same creek it was meant to condemn. Either way, the ringing filled the spaces between the crickets and the frogs, and the distant, indifferent murmur of the creek, doing what it did, regardless of who was listening or what they'd lost. Titan lay pressed against his right side. Not casual, not the easy proximity of a dog sharing a porch with its owner on a warm evening. This was different. This was the full body contact of an animal that had made a decision in the water, a decision forged in the moment his paws hit the current and his teeth found the collar, and his legs drove against a force that was trying to take the one person he had left and had not yet released that decision. Every time Declan shifted, the dog shifted with him. Every time he leaned forward, the weight came with him. Counterbalance. Anchor. The 85-pound argument against disappearing. The evidence was gone. All of it. He ran the inventory in his mind the way he used to run equipment checks before a walk. Systematic, thorough, merciless in its accounting. The laptop, gone from the kitchen counter during the break-in, the clean rectangle of dust where it had sat, now the most visible thing in the room. The printed photographs, gone from the folder itself left behind as if to confirm that the removal was selective and intentional. The backup samples, poured out, the empty jars arranged with a neatness that felt like contempt. The legal pad, with its timeline and coordinates, and Mrs. Guidry's careful description of water that tasted like pennies. Gone. And now the field samples, the last set, the ones collected from the tributary near the pipe, sitting on the bottom of the creek, sinking into sediment, becoming part of the thing they were meant to prove. June was suspended. Officially. Formally, the kind of suspended that came with a letter and a signature and the specific bureaucratic language that said, "We are protecting the institution from the inconvenience of your honesty." Declan had nothing. He closed his eyes. The walk. 30 meters. 20. 15. The wire in the gravel. The pressure plate concealed beneath a layer of dust that matched the road so perfectly it could have been poured from the same bag. The breathing that slowed. The hands that didn't shake. The focused, narrowing tunnel of attention that reduced the entire world to a single equation. The device. The approach. The space between. But then, the part after. The part they didn't train you for. Not at Great Lakes. Not at Eglin. Not anywhere in the pipeline that turned 18-year-olds into technicians who could walk toward death at a controlled heart rate and call it a Tuesday. The second device. The one positioned 8 meters to the left. The one no survey had found. The one that waited in the ground like a thought that hadn't been thought yet, patient and invisible. Until Kyle Medina, 24, Corpus Christi, 2 deployments, hands that shook when he ate breakfast, but steadied when he put on the suit, stood exactly where his chief told him to stand, and the ground said no. When the device doesn't go off on the first attempt, you don't leave. The words came from somewhere below thought, below memory, from the place where training lived after it stopped being training and became architecture, the load-bearing walls of the self that held everything else up. You don't leave. You reassess. You approach again. EOD doctrine. The principle that had kept him walking toward devices for 18 years when every rational calculation said to walk away. The principle that said, the device is still there. The threat is still real. Your failure to render it safe on the first attempt does not release you from the obligation to try again. June's name on the screen. He stared at it for 2 full rings. 3. Almost let it go to the voicemail he'd never set up, because voicemail was a technology designed for people who expected to be contacted, and Declan had spent 3 years building a life whose central operating principle was the elimination of expectations. Yeah, I called someone. Her voice was different. Not the tight frustration of the DHEC stall. Not the raw vulnerability of Georgia. Something that had passed through both of those things and come out the other side, sharper, cleaner. Decided in a way that didn't ask for permission or approval. Not DHEC. Not my supervisor. Not anyone in the state chain of command. Who? EPA Region 4. Federal. An investigator named Sandra Chen. I met her at a water quality conference in Savannah 2 years ago. She's based in Atlanta. She's not connected to the state system. She's not connected to anyone who has a reason to make this go away. I sent her everything I had before they locked my account access. The field data, my independent samples, the concentration gradients, the pipe coordinates, the photographic documentation, everything. And she's listening. She wants the video. What video? The video you're going to get when you go back out there. Declan looked at Titan. The dog looked back. Brown eyes, steady, unblinking, carrying no opinion about federal investigators or chain of command or the bureaucratic architecture of environmental enforcement, but carrying a very clear opinion about the man beside him, which was, I am here. I have been here. Whatever comes next, I will be there too. One more time, Declan said, not to June, not to the phone, to the porch, to the dark, to the dog, to the memory of a road where the walk was 30 meters and the distance between the beginning and the end was the entire width of a life. The long walk. One more time. He went at 2 in the morning. Not because 2 in the morning was tactically optimal, though it was. Because 2 in the morning was when the world stripped itself to essentials. Dark, quiet, the things you carried and the distance between where you were and where you needed to be. The same essentials that had governed every approach he'd ever made, in a suit or out of one, on roads in Helmand and in corridors in Kandahar, and on docks in places he still couldn't name because the names were classified and the memories weren't. The camera was borrowed from Ray Thibodeau, a waterproof action camera the old fisherman used to document his catch for the insurance company that had, 3 years ago, raised his premiums because the catch was declining, and the company considered declining catch a risk factor. Small, solid, capable of recording in near darkness at a resolution that would hold up on a screen in a federal hearing room. Declan had spent an hour learning its controls, testing the night mode, making sure the timestamp and GPS overlay were active and accurate. Evidence that couldn't be challenged. Evidence that documented not just what was there, but when and where, and that the person capturing it had been methodical enough to make carelessness impossible as a defense. He parked a half-mile from the tributary access point and walked in. No flashlight, no phone light. The moon was 3/4 full, and the low country sky was clear, and the marsh grass cast faint silver shadows on the water that moved as the wind moved, and were still when the wind was still. His boots found the path by memory, the same path he'd walked with June, the same path Titan had traced, with his nose low and his instincts running ahead of both of them. Titan moved at his left side, not ahead, beside. The dog had recalculated his operating distance since the drowning, closing the gap between handler and partner to something that a military canine evaluator would have noted as non-standard, and that Declan recognized as something beyond protocol. The dog was not going to let him out of reach. Not tonight. Not on this walk. Fuss. The command, German, heel, was unnecessary. Titan was already there, but saying it was part of the ritual, the same way checking the suit was part of the ritual, and slowing the breathing was part of the ritual, and walking when everything in you screamed to run was part of the ritual. You didn't do the ritual because it changed the outcome. You did the ritual because it turned chaos into procedure, and procedure was the only thing between you and the fear that would stop you from taking the next step. The pipe was where they'd left it. Same position, same concealment, the palm fronds arranged over the bank like camouflage, which was exactly what they were. Declan crouched beside it, knees protesting, shoulder humming its low, constant objection, and set the camera on the small tripod he'd wedged between two cypress roots. He angled the lens to capture the pipe opening, the water below it, and the GPS coordinates burned into the lower right corner of the frame. Then he waited. The walk had always been about waiting. People who didn't understand EOD thought it was about the bomb, the wire, the circuit, the detonator that either fired or didn't. But the bomb was just the object. The walk was about the space between you and the object, and the time it took to cross that space, and the discipline required to move through that time without letting urgency or fear, or the perfectly reasonable desire to be anywhere else, compromise the precision that was the only thing standing between you and the worst version of today. 30 meters of waiting. 20. 15. Here, in the dark, on the bank of a tributary in the low country, the distance was different, but the walk was the same. The approach, the patience, the refusal to move faster than the evidence allowed. "Bleib," he murmured. Titan lowered himself to the ground, body flat, chin on paws, ears in their slow rotation. The command was MWD protocol. Stay, hold position, let the silence do the work. And the dog understood it not as an instruction, but as a shared agreement. We are here. We are still. We wait. At 2:47, the pipe began to flow. Not a trickle, a steady, deliberate discharge that pulsed with the rhythm of a pump. Not gravity, not natural seepage, a machine. Someone, somewhere behind the tree line, on the other side of a property fence that marked the boundary of Palmetto Industrial's back 40, had turned a valve, or triggered a timer, or pressed a button, and the pipe was doing what the pipe had been built to do. The liquid was darker than creek water. It carried a faint chemical sheen that caught the moonlight and held it on the surface in oily ribbons that spread downstream with the current, dissolving into the flow, the way a lie dissolves into a conversation, gradually, invisibly, until the thing it was mixed with could no longer remember being clean. Declan checked the camera. Recording. Red light blinking. Timestamp running. GPS locked. Beside him, Titan remained motionless. Not sleeping, the ears proved that, rotating in their slow sweep, cataloging every sound the forest produced and filing each one under irrelevant or worth noting. Once, only once, the dog's head turned sharply toward the tree line, his body tightening beneath Declan's hand in a way that said, "Something is there." A sound in the brush. Footsteps, maybe. An animal. Or not. They held position. The sound didn't repeat. The camera kept recording. He stayed for 47 minutes. The discharge ran the entire time. Steady, mechanical, indifferent. 47 minutes of industrial waste pumped into a tributary that fed a creek, that fed a marsh, that fed a community that had been filing complaints and raising children and burying fish and waiting for someone with authority to decide that what was happening to their water was worth the paperwork to stop. The flow stopped at 3:34. The pump went silent. The pipe dripped. 3 drops, 4, 5, and then sat in the mud, inert, looking like nothing more than what its builders had intended it to look like. Nothing. Declan retrieved the camera, checked the footage on the small screen. 47 minutes of continuous, unambiguous, time-stamped, GPS-tagged evidence of illegal discharge from a concealed pipe into a residential watershed. Enough. He looked at Titan. The dog was already on his feet, tail low, body oriented toward the path that led back to the truck. Ready. Not relieved. Dogs didn't traffic in relief, but finished, in the way that a partner is finished when the work is done and the extraction route is clear, and the only remaining task is to leave. Declan stood, his knees cracked, his shoulder burned, his left ear gave him nothing but the ringing, and his right ear gave him the creek and the frogs and the wind and the sound of his own breathing returning, slowly, to something that resembled the breathing of a man who was going to be fine. "Let's go home, buddy." The Sable Creek Town Hall was built for 70 people. There were 112 inside when Declan arrived, and more standing along the walls and in the doorway and on the front steps, where the evening air carried the sound of voices through the open windows and scattered them across the parking lot like seeds. He hadn't organized this. He hadn't sent a flyer or posted an announcement or done any of the things that people who know how to mobilize communities do. Because he didn't know how to mobilize communities. He knew how to walk toward dangerous things, one step at a time, and hope the outcome justified the approach. But somewhere in the weeks between the first dead fish and this Thursday evening, in the door-to-door visits, in Ray Thibodeau's net shed, in Mrs. Guidry's kitchen, in the slow accumulation of catch logs and water samples and photographs of rashes on children's arms. Something had happened that didn't require organizing. The community had organized itself, the way water finds its own level, not because someone directed it, but because the slope was there and the pressure was there, and the only direction left was forward. The room smelled like floor polish and old wood, and the particular warmth of too many people in a space built for fewer. Someone had set up a coffee station near the back door, a percolator that had been brewing since 5 o'clock, a sleeve of foam cups, a jar of powdered creamer, a plate of shortbread that Mrs. Guidry had baked that morning because, she said, a meeting without food wasn't a meeting. It was an ambush. And she didn't believe in ambushes. Mrs. Guidry sat in the front row, wearing a blue dress that said she considered this occasion formal, and a jawline that said she considered it a reckoning. Ray Thibodeau was 3 rows back, thick hands folded on his knees, wearing a clean button-down shirt that he'd clearly ironed himself, based on the creative interpretation of where the creases were supposed to go. Old man Hébert leaned against the wall near the window, arms crossed, the posture of a man who had come to listen and was prepared to walk out if the listening proved to be theater. Delia Rowan sat beside the young mother from the Robichaux place, the one whose boy had the rash, and the mother held her phone with photos loaded, thumb resting on the screen like a finger on a trigger. At a folding table at the front, 2 officials from EPA Region 4 sat with laptops and folders and the professional neutrality of federal employees who had been briefed on a situation and had made the drive from Atlanta because the situation warranted the drive. Sandra Chen, the senior investigator June had called, was mid-50s, reading glasses, short gray hair, and the particular stillness of a woman who had conducted enough of these sessions to know that the most important thing she could do in the first 30 minutes was listen. Warren Tate sat on the far side of the room. He had brought a lawyer, a man from Charleston whose suit cost more than the trucks in the parking lot, and a second folder of compliance documents. Warren's face was composed, professional, the mask of a man who had prepared for this meeting the way he prepared for everything, with paperwork, with talking points, with the practiced belief that a sufficient quantity of documentation could withstand any amount of reality. Mr. Voss? Sandra Chen looked at him over her reading glasses. The room shifted, not the dramatic silence of a courtroom drama, but the settling of weight, the way a building adjusts when something heavy moves inside it. Declan stood. Titan, lying beside his chair in the aisle, tolerated without objection by everyone in the room, including the EPA officials, because this was Sable Creek and the dog had been part of the story since before the story had a name, stood with him. The movement was simultaneous, handler and partner rising in the same breath, and several people in the room noticed the synchronization, the way they would notice a statement that didn't need to be spoken aloud. He walked to the front the way he walked every approach, not fast, not slow, each step chosen. He carried a folder, inside, a USB drive with 47 minutes of footage, a printed timeline, the community health data from the door-to-door visits, June's independent field results submitted before her suspension. Not much. Not everything. Enough. "My name is Declan Voss," he said.
His voice carried the room not because it was loud, but because it was steady. And steadiness, in a room full of people who had been uncertain for too long, was its own kind of authority. I'm a retired Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy. Explosive Ordnance Disposal. 18 years. I've been living in Sable Creek for 3 years.
Fixing boats, keeping to myself, and not particularly interested in being here tonight. A breath of something, not laughter exactly, recognition, moved through the room. The sound people make when someone says the thing they're thinking. 6 weeks ago, my dog refused to drink from a creek he'd been drinking from every morning for 3 years. He let that sentence sit. It was, he'd realized in the days since, the only sentence that mattered. Everything else, the samples, the pipe, the compliance reports, the drowning, all of it, was downstream of that single moment on a Tuesday morning when an animal trusted its instincts and a man trusted the animal. I tested the water. It was contaminated with industrial solvents at concentrations 4 to 8 times the acceptable threshold. I followed the contamination upstream to a concealed discharge pipe feeding directly into a tributary of this watershed. I documented the pipe, the contamination levels, and the pattern of health effects on this community. The fish kills, the well water complaints, the declining catch, the skin rashes on children who swam in water their parents had every reason to believe was safe. He opened the folder, set the USB drive on the table. On this drive is 47 minutes of continuous video showing active discharge from that pipe. Time-stamped, GPS tagged. Recorded at 2:47 a.m. last Tuesday. The pipe originates from the direction of Palmetto Industrial's property. I spent 18 years walking toward things designed to kill people. This is the same walk, different device. The room was still, not the stillness of agreement or opposition, the stillness of recalibration, people hearing something that rearranged the air and needing a moment to breathe the new version. Mrs. Guidry stood. She hadn't been called. She hadn't been scheduled. She stood because Lorraine Guidry had been standing up in rooms full of people since before most of them were born, and the concept of waiting for permission was as foreign to her as the concept of whispering. My name is Lorraine Guidry. I've lived on Sable Creek for 47 years. My well water has tasted like metal for 3 months. My granddaughter swam in the creek and has had a rash up both arms for 2 weeks. My neighbor's fish are dying. My tomatoes won't grow. She looked at Sandra Chen with the directness of a woman who had outlived her patience for politeness. I called every office in this state. I filed every form they gave me. Nobody came until he did. She pointed at Declan, not dramatically, factually, the way you point at a thing that exists. She sat back down. The blue dress settled around her like a flag being folded. Ray Thibodeau stood next. He held a spiral notebook, the kind sold at gas stations for $1, with a cover that had gone soft from being carried in the pocket of a man who worked on water. Ray Thibodeau, commercial fisherman, 41 years. These are my catch records. He held up the notebook. Last 3 years, my catches dropped 40%. Shrimp are gone from the upper creek. Crabs are thin. The bream are fewer and smaller, and some of them have lesions I've never seen in 4 decades on this water. He set the notebook on the table beside Declan's folder. That's not a cycle. That's a cause. The young mother from the Robichaux place stood without speaking. She held her phone up, screen facing the room. The photograph showed a child's arm, forearm, wrist, the soft skin where the creek water had touched, covered in a raised, angry rash that made several people in the room draw a breath they didn't intend to. She sat back down. She didn't need to say anything. The photograph said it. June stepped forward. She stood beside Declan, not behind, not in front, beside, and the positioning was itself a statement that neither of them had discussed, and both of them understood. Dr. June Calloway, hydrologist. The independent field data confirms Mr. Voss's documentation. Chlorinated solvent concentrations increasing on a gradient consistent with a point source upstream. This is not natural contamination. This is not runoff or seepage. This is direct, deliberate, concealed discharge into a residential watershed. She placed her own folder on the table. Data, maps, concentration charts that showed a line climbing steadily upstream, like a graph of something that had been hidden and was now, finally, visible. Sandra Chen reviewed the USB drive, opened June's folder, read in silence for a period that felt longer than it was because every person in the room was watching her read. Then she looked across the room at Warren Tate. Warren's lawyer leaned forward, adjusted his tie. My client has fully complied with all applicable. We have 47 minutes of video, Sandra Chen said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The sentence did the work. The lawyer stopped. Warren Tate looked at Declan, not at the EPA officials, not at June, not at the lawyer he'd hired to build a wall of language between himself and consequence. He looked at Declan, and his face held something that Declan recognized because he'd seen it in mirrors and in the faces of men standing over things they'd broken, and in the particular expression of a human being arriving, too late and all at once, at the place where the story they'd been telling themselves met the story that was actually true. You don't know what they made me do. The voice was quiet, stripped. The compliance reports and the press shirts and the calibrated handshake were gone. And what remained was a man sitting in a folding chair in a town hall, telling a room full of people he'd poisoned that the poison hadn't been his idea. It wasn't a defense. It was a confession that had been building pressure for 3 years and had finally found the room it needed to be spoken in. Sandra Chen removed her glasses. We're opening a formal investigation. They met at the boat ramp 3 days after the hearing. Not by arrangement. Declan had stopped arranging things, or at least stopped pretending that the things that happened around him were the product of planning, rather than the slow, persistent gravity of consequences working their way downhill. He was checking the hull of a replacement John boat, donated by Old Man Hebert, who had driven it to Declan's property on a trailer hitched to a truck that was older than both of them, and had said, with the particular brevity of a man who found generosity embarrassing, I got 2. Only need 1. Don't make a thing of it. When Warren Tate's pickup pulled into the lot, the truck was dusty. That was the first thing Declan noticed. The last time he'd seen it, at Gracie's, It had been clean in a way that suggested a man who kept his surfaces polished so no one would look at what was underneath. Now the dust sat on the hood and the fenders and the windshield, like something that had been allowed, for the first time, to accumulate. The truck of a man who had stopped performing. Warren walked toward him. No folder, no lawyer, no handshake. He stopped 10 feet away, hands in his pockets, and looked at the water the way a man looks at a thing he has damaged and cannot undo. "They cut the treatment budget 60%, Warren said. No preamble, no setup. The words came out as if they had been held in a pressurized container, and someone had finally released the valve. Corporate, out of state, 3 years ago. They said the margins were too thin and the compliance costs were too high, and if I couldn't find a way to operate within the new parameters, they'd find someone who could. And I had 120 people depending on that plant for a paycheck. So you found a way." "I found a pipe." First time, I told myself it was temporary. Emergency measure while I negotiated with corporate for the restoration of the treatment budget. Temporary. That was the word I used. He exhaled through his nose. Not a sigh. Something heavier, something that had weight and volume and the particular density of a truth that has been compressed for too long. Temporary became 6 months. 6 months became a year. A year became the way things were, and the way things were became the only way I knew how to keep the lights on. "Everybody freezes once," Declan said. The words came out the same way they'd come out on the porch with June. Same sentence, same cadence, but different now. Different because saying it to a woman who had failed to file a report was one thing, and saying it to a man who had poisoned a watershed for 3 years was another. And the fact that the sentence still felt true, not adequate, not comfortable, but true, said something about the nature of failure that Declan didn't fully understand, and probably never would. Everyone freezes. The question is always the same. What do you do after? "What happens now?" Warren asked. "EPA investigation. They'll subpoena the discharge records, the financial communications with corporate, the maintenance logs. They'll want to know when it started, who authorized it, and who knew. Your cooperation matters." "I know." He looked at the water. 120 families. That plant is half this town's income. And the other half of this town has been drinking what your plant was dumping. Warren absorbed that, nodded, not agreement, acknowledgement. The slow nod of a man who had arrived at the place where the two halves of his argument canceled each other out, and what remained was just the damage, sitting in the open, waiting to be measured. "I am not your judge," Declan said. "I was just the one who looked." Warren met his eyes. "Yeah, that's the problem with looking. Once you see it, you can't stop." Declan stood at the boat ramp and watched the dust settle. The creek moved past the pilings. A great blue heron lifted from the shallows downstream, wings wide, climbing into the afternoon light with the unhurried authority of a creature that had been here before any of them, and would be here after all of them were done. Hey, hey, June's voice. Different again. Not the tight control of DHEC, or the raw confession on the porch, or the professional clarity of the hearing. Something new. Something that had passed through all of those registers and settled into one he hadn't heard before. I talked to the regional director this morning. DHEC isn't reinstating me. The suspension stands. I'm sorry. Don't be. EPA offered me a consulting position. Field hydrology. Water quality assessment for enforcement cases. Based here, South Carolina. Here. The office is in Columbia, but the field work, the watersheds, the communities, the actual water, that's all here. The low country, the coast, the places where the problems are. There's real work to do, not the kind that sits in a queue. Here. Yeah, Titan had been lying near the boat trailer. Now he stood, stretched, the careful, full-body stretch of a dog whose joints had earned their stiffness, and walked to Declan's side. His tail moved. Not the enthusiastic wag of a young dog greeting a friend, but the slow, deliberate sweep of an older animal registering a shift in the emotional weather and finding it favorable. Okay. One word. Not a promise, not a declaration, not the kind of thing anyone would put on a card or frame on a wall. Just a door left open in a house that had been locked for 3 years. Okay, June said, and in the way she said it, there was the understanding, shared, unspoken, more real for being neither named nor examined, that the word meant the same thing to both of them, which was, I'm not sure what this is, but I'm not running from it. The dock was finished. Not perfect. Declan had no illusions about his carpentry, which occupied the space between functional and inelegant, with the confidence of a man who had never built anything intended to be looked at, only things intended to hold weight. The boards were cypress, bought from a mill outside Beaufort. The posts were pressure-treated pine, sunk 3 feet into the creek bank. The hardware was marine-grade stainless from Marlowe's, and the total cost was roughly what he'd earned fixing Hebert's boat, which gave the project a symmetry he appreciated without being able to articulate why. He had built it in the 2 weeks after the hearing, working in the mornings before the heat settled into the marsh like a guest that had been invited for an hour and stayed for a season. And in the evenings, after it retreated enough to make the air breathable again. His hands moved through the work with a precision that surprised him, not because the precision was new, but because its application was. These hands had spent their professional life learning the architecture of devices designed to destroy. Wires, circuits, pressure plates, the geometry of blast radii and the chemistry of high explosives, and the 1,000 small, irreversible decisions that separated a device that detonated from a device that didn't. Now they were learning the architecture of things designed to stay. The joints were tight. The screws were countersunk. The surface was sanded smooth enough to sit on barefoot. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't meant to be. It was solid, and it was here, and it would be here tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. And that category of accomplishment, the building of a thing that persisted, was so foreign to a career defined by the rendering of threats into harmlessness that Declan found himself standing on the finished dock for several minutes after driving the last screw, simply looking at it. The way you look at something you've made that you didn't know you could make. Titan walked the dock with the careful dignity of an aging animal negotiating a surface that hadn't existed last time he checked. His joints were stiffer now. The mornings took longer. The stretches lasted longer. The stairs required a negotiation between will and capability that he conducted with the same quiet stubbornness he brought to everything. 7 years. The math was simple. The math was also not the point. He reached the end of the dock, sniffed the air, looked down at the water below with the focused attention of an animal who remembered what the water had done and was deciding, on his own terms and his own schedule, whether to revise his assessment. Take your time. Titan lay down, lowered his chin to his paws, looked at the creek. Declan sat beside him. The coffee was black. The mug was the same one from Charleston, ceramic, worn smooth, chip in the rim he'd never fixed, because fixing it would mean admitting it was broken. And the mug worked fine the way it was. The shoulder ached. The tinnitus hummed. The scar on his left arm caught the first light and held it in the ridged, pale tissue, like a map of a country he'd visited and left. He filled a small metal bowl from the creek, the same pool, the same spot, the same water that had started everything 6 weeks ago, when a dog had lowered his head to drink, and something had spoken to him in a frequency below language and above instinct, and the dog had listened. The water wasn't clean, not yet. The EPA investigation had shut down Palmetto's discharge line, but remediation would take months, maybe longer, and the creek carried the residue of 3 years of damage in its sediment and its banks and its biome, the way any living system carries the residue of what has been done to it. Slowly, in concentrations that diminish but don't disappear, in a trajectory that bends toward recovery without promising arrival. He set the bowl in front of Titan. The dog looked at the bowl, looked at Declan, looked at the bowl again. The moment held itself open, the way moments do when the thing that happens next will mean more than the thing itself. When the symbol and the fact converge into a single action that is both ordinary and irreducible. It's okay, buddy. Titan lowered his head. His nose touched the surface. The whiskers spread the water in tiny ripples that caught the morning light and scattered it in directions that couldn't be predicted or controlled. He drank. Not much. A few unhurried laps, the tongue moving through the water with the same methodical patience the dog brought to everything, to walks, to commands, to the particular task of keeping a damaged man tethered to a world that hadn't always given him a reason to stay. Then he lifted his head, licked his muzzle once, set his chin back on his paws. Yeah. June came around the side of the cabin carrying 2 cups from the gas station in Beaufort, the place with the hand-lettered sign that said, "Coffee is ready when it's ready," and meant it. She was wearing the field clothes, the boots, the hair pulled back in the knot that had never, in the weeks he'd known her, survived a full morning without launching a small-scale insurrection against the elastic band tasked with containing it. She didn't wave, didn't call out, just walked onto the dock, handed him a cup, and sat down in the space beside him that had been empty for 3 years, and that he had, without deciding to, stopped trying to keep that way. Titan lifted his head from his paws and placed his nose on June's knee. The full weight of his muzzle, the deliberate, unhurried contact of an animal that had decided, through whatever process of assessment and acceptance dogs use to evaluate the people in their lives, that this person was no longer a visitor. He doesn't do that with everyone. June looked at him, the beginning of a smile, the kind that arrives not because something is funny, but because something is recognized. You said that before. Still true. They sat. The creek moved past the dock in its slow, persistent way, carrying what it carried, bearing what had been done to it, continuing because continuing was what water did. A heron stood in the shallows downstream, one leg raised, waiting for something that only it could perceive. The live oaks held the morning light in their upper branches and released it in pieces that fell on the water like offerings, small, golden, silent. Declan drank his coffee. June drank hers. Titan lay between them, breathing. He thought about the walk. 30 meters. 20. 15. The wire in the gravel. The breathing that slowed. The hands that didn't shake. He had spent 18 years walking toward things that could end him. That had been the definition, the purpose, the identity. You walked toward the device because no one else could, and you walked alone because putting another person in the blast radius was a failure of the most fundamental and unforgivable kind. But sitting here, on a dock he'd built with hands that had learned late and clumsily the difference between taking apart and putting together, beside a woman who had failed and chosen, against the weight of her own guilt, to stand in front of a room full of people and tell the truth, with a dog who had jumped into a current that could have killed him because the alternative was unacceptable. Sitting here, the walk felt different. Not because the destination had changed, because the direction had. He wasn't walking towards something that could end him. He was walking towards something that might, if he stopped resisting it, let him begin. The creek flowed, not clean, not fixed, not returned to the version of itself that had existed before anyone built anything on its banks, or poured anything into its current, or asked it to carry more than it was meant to carry. But flowing, still flowing, moving through the damage the way all living systems move through damage, not by erasing it, but by continuing, by carrying what remains, by finding, in the ordinary and stubborn persistence of motion, something that is not redemption and not healing and not the clean resolution that stories promise and life does not deliver. Something quieter than that, something enough.